Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my May wrap up and telling you about all the books that I read in the month of May. So I ended up reading 15 books in the month of May, some of which were very short. And it was a bit of a weird reading month. I feel like it was very top heavy in that I feel like I read very little in the first 2 weeks of May and then read a ton in the second 2 weeks of May, but there we go. So I'll start off, as I often do, with some classics. One thing I did in May was reread two novels by Anthony Trollope. In April, I finished off reading my 47th Anthony Trollope novel, which was my final Anthony Trollope novel. He wrote 47 novels and I've now read them all. And so what did I do? Having finished Anthony Trollope's 47 novels, I immediately reread two, partly because I wanted to reread these for some videos I was making about Anthony Trollope. They were two favourite Trollope novels of mine that I hadn't read for ages. But I think making my Trollope Thursday videos and talking about Anthony Trollope all the time is making me really excited about Anthony Trollope, and therefore all I actually really want to read is Anthony Trollope. So I did reread two Anthony Trollope books in May. Will I reread some in June? Maybe not, but maybe we'll see. So one book that I reread was The Claverings. I listened to this on audiobook and really enjoyed it. This is one of my favourite Trollope standalones. It tells a story of a family called the Claverings, chiefly focusing on a young man called Harry Clavering, who at the beginning of the book, we meet him when he is in the midst of being jilted by a woman called Julia, who he has been in love with. They've been engaged, but Julia has decided that Harry is not rich enough for her and she's going to marry someone richer. We then sort of very quickly skip through a few years, during which Harry meets another young woman, falls in love with her, becomes engaged to her. But not long after he has become engaged to Florence, Julia's husband dies, and Julia is now a wealthy widow, and Harry finds himself, torn between his old love and his new. There are also lots of other things going on in the Claverings. There are some truly fantastic subplots. I, in fact, maybe prefer the subplots to the main plot, but I do love the main plot too, and I think the characterization in the Claverings is so great. Harry is one of those characters where he's in some ways quite dislikable and quite frustrating, but also you do feel for him and understand him, and he's one of Anthony Trollope's really well drawn, flawed young men. And I think the subplots and the themes in the Claverings are really fantastic. The way it looks at love and marriage, and especially at abusive marriage, which is the theme of some of the subplots, I think that's done fantastically. I have actually filmed a full individual review of the Claverings, which I probably won't put up until August, because I want to do the other Trollope Thursday videos that I want to do first, but I thought that it might be nice to film individual reviews of the Anthony Trollope books that I'm rereading as I reread them, so that'll be up at some point. And then the other Anthony Trollope novel I reread was Dr. Wurtle's School. I didn't actually read this physical edition. I also listened to this on audiobook. This is a very short Anthony Trollope novel and another real favourite of mine. And it was lovely to reread it. This is a novel about a man called Dr. Wurtle who runs a school. He's also a clergyman, and in his school he employs two people, Mr. and Mrs. Peacock. Mr. Peacock as a schoolmaster, Mrs. Peacock kind of as a matron, I suppose. But Mr. and Mrs. Peacock have a secret, and early on in this novel, Dr. Wurtle finds out about this secret, and Mr. and Mrs. Peacock's lives begin to unravel. And how will Dr. Wurtle react to this? It's a novel about sort of moral dilemmas and reputation, and morality, and sort of how codes of morality are interpreted within the Victorian period. And I just think it's fantastic and a really, really interesting Victorian novel looking at, the problems with certain values that were held in the Victorian period, and I just think it's really, really worth a read. Again, I have filmed a full individual book review of Dr. Wurtle's School, which will be up at some point, I guess probably in August, but I do think it's a fantastic novel and very much worth your time. Then another Victorian reread, I also read Tess of the D'Urbervilles in May. Again, not this copy, I listened to this on audiobook, and this I was reading because I'm taking part in Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy read-along. We're nearing the end now. We've been reading Thomas Hardy's novels in publication order, and we've just got 2 books left. As always, I got a lot out of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, thought it was a really interesting novel. It is a story of a girl called Tess who is from a rural working class background, but early on in the novel, her father discovers that their family are in fact descended from a very wealthy family who are part of the gentry called the D'Urbervilles, and her father thinks that, their position in life should be better than it is, and they send Tess off to visit a local family called call the D'Urbervilles to sort of claim kinship, and everything goes wrong from there. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is not my favourite Thomas Hardy novel. It's never been my favourite Thomas Hardy novel. It was the first one I read as a teenager, and I've now read it, I think, like 4 times. And I do think it's a great book, and I do think it's really, really thematically interesting, but it would always be sort of in the middle of my Thomas Hardy ranking. It would never be an absolute favourite for me. I think partly because I find it such a bleak, hopeless book. And interestingly, I don't find Jude the Obscure as bleak and hopeless as I find Tess, which I think is not the case for many people. And I guess I'll talk about that when I reread Jude in July or August. But I feel like Tess of the D'Urbervilles is such a stark novel where there's like not even a glimmer of hope, because even the bits of the book where Tess is happy, I'm like not happy about the reasons that she's happy. It's a bit hard to explain without spoilers, but there's just a lot of characters I really hate in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and you just watch Tess being just treated terribly by everyone, and I just find it a bit too much. So I do think it's a really fantastic book. I do think it's worth a read, but just not my favourite Thomas Hardy novel. Then I read one more Victorian book in May, and this one was actually new to me, not a reread, and that was The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings by L.T. Mead and Robert Eustace. This was also for a read-along. I finally managed to actually take part in one of Roy from Roy Reads Anything's neglected Victorian bestsellers read-alongs, and The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings is a late Victorian crime novel. Well, I say novel, is it a novel? Maybe it's an interconnected collection of short stories. It sort of mostly reads like short stories, in quite a similar way to the Sherlock Holmes short stories, but the sort of final 2 stories do have a bit more of an overarching plot, and there is sort of like a dramatic climax to the thing as a whole. So I don't really know whether I would count it as a novel or a collection of short stories. But anyway, these stories are all told from the perspective of a man called Norman Head. And many years ago, Norman Head met in Italy a beautiful but dangerous woman who enticed him to join the Brotherhood of the Seven Kings, which he soon realised was a criminal organisation, so he backed away and ran away. And then years later in London, this woman comes back into his life and is the head of a criminal gang doing dangerous things, and Norman Head is trying to stop her. And Norman Head is quite hopeless. When I first started reading the collection, I was like, oh, it's a bit Sherlock Holmesy. It definitely has a real sort of like Sherlock Holmes short story vibe to it. And then I thought, I know what it's like. It's like reading the Sherlock Holmes short stories, but there's no Sherlock Holmes, there's only Watson. He's got his revolver, he wants to defeat the criminals, but he just doesn't know what he's doing. And there's so many things where you're like, it's really obvious what's going on, that's a terrible idea, and then he just does it anyway. You know, he's very naive and oblivious. But I found that really, really funny. And in general, I just found it a very entertaining collection. Would I have liked to know a bit more about the villain, who is sort of like mostly off the page? Yes, maybe, but in general, I thought this was really good fun. And a nice, entertaining Victorian read. So I definitely think if you enjoy the Sherlock Holmes short stories, you'd probably enjoy The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings as well. Then I read one 20th century classic in May, and that was I, Claudius by Robert Graves. I'm holding this weirdly because there is some nudity on the cover, and I feel like YouTube would not approve of that. But yeah, this is a historical novel from the 1930s, but set in ancient Rome, and it is a fictional autobiography of the Roman Emperor Claudius, but before he becomes emperor. So we follow him from his birth through to, I guess he's in his sort of 50s, I think, by the end of the novel. And I have quite mixed feelings about I, Claudius. I'm glad that I finally read it because I mean to read it for a while, but I found it a novel that I was like very, very disconnected from. Basically, it is a fictional autobiography of Claudius, and it's in his first person perspective, but he's not in quite a lot of the book. And basically, whenever the novel was following Claudius as a character and we were following what he was doing and his interactions with people, I was really, really engaged. But a lot of the novel is Claudius writing about things that happened that he wasn't personally a witness to, and then it is really just a sort of recounting of facts and reads like you're reading a history book, but quite a biased history book rather than a novel. And that kind of makes sense because Claudius says that he wants to write history books and that's sort of his aim in life. He wants to be a historian, so it makes sense that he writes like a historian, but also it does make quite a lot of the book quite dry. So there were bits where I was really engaged, but there were other bits where I was struggling a bit, where it feels very zoomed out and sort of unemotional, and also where there are so many characters introduced, many of whom you're sort of not really getting to know as people at all. that it is a little bit hard to follow. So I have sort of mixed feelings about it. There is a sequel to this, Claudius the God, which I expect will follow Claudius more directly. So I'm kind of thinking maybe I would read that, but at the same time I didn't love I, Claudius that much, though I do think there were some really interesting elements to it. One thing I thought was quite interesting was the way it explores disability and ableism within ancient Roman society. Claudius, the real historical figure, was disabled as far as we know, and the way that Claudius, the character, is treated in this book, especially when he is a child, is really grim to read, but obviously is there to sort of make a point and to criticise both ancient Roman society and, you know, presumably also the time in which Robert Graves was writing, and I thought that was very interesting, and especially the look at, like, you know, Claudius is very much judged by his physical appearance and his physical abilities rather than what's going on in his head. And I thought that sort of theme was really, really interesting, but, you know, that is a relatively minor part of the novel in comparison to all of the political intrigue, which I was slightly less interested in. So there we go, a bit of a mixed read for me. Then I also read 3 contemporary works of historical fiction this month, all of which were from the Walter Scott Prize long list. So I have reviewed these 3 in a separate video. I will quickly talk about them here, but I won't go into much depth because I have reviewed them at a lot greater length in another video. So one that I read was Venetian Vespers by John Banville, which I really didn't like at all. This was very much not for me. It is a novel about a man who goes to Venice with his wife. They're relatively recently married. There's some kind of mystery or secret in her life, and when he gets to Venice, slightly mysterious things start to happen, and it's a bit of a mystery novel, but with a very unreliable, exceptionally dislikable character whose head I very much did not want to be in. And I also didn't especially love the way this novel was paced. I buddy read this with Shelley Swearingen, and I was looking forward to buddy reading with Shelley because we very often have very different taste in books, and there are many books that she loves that I don't get on with, and vice versa. We both love historical fiction, but very different kinds of historical fiction. But we have now found a book that we both very much agree on because neither of us like the Venetian Vespers at all. So there we go. The other 2 books I read from the Walter Scott Prize long list I liked a lot more. Helm by Sarah Hall, I really enjoyed. This is a strange, odd, slightly experimental novel spanning a range of history from the Neolithic period to the present day, looking at how various people are affected by and interact with a wind called Helm, which is a gust of wind in Cumbria, which is named and has its kind of own personality, and I just really enjoyed the playfulness of this novel, as well as the way it looks at history and storytelling and kind of moves through time. I feel like some of the endings to the various storylines were a little bit too ambiguous for my taste, but I think that's very, very much a personal thing. Overall, I thought this was a great read. And I also read The Pretender by Joe Harkin, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. Just wonderful. One of my highlights of the year so far. The Pretender is set in 15th century England and follows the coming of age story of a boy called John. We meet him when he's 10, living his ordinary rural village life, when one day 2 men show up at his father's house and take him away and say, "You're not actually your father's son, you are in fact the son of a nobleman, and you are a possible pretender to the throne. We're going to raise you to be ready to be king." And we follow his life, and it's just great. It's just so good. Like, just really, really top-notch historical fiction, as well as being an incredible coming-of-age story. It's a fantastic character study, while also, like, really interestingly exploring this very turbulent point in time and looking at power and power struggle, and how power corrupts in just the most powerful way. I thought it was just wonderful. But as well as dealing with all of those serious issues, it is very, very funny and irreverent and witty, and just has this sort of great writing style to it that makes it a real pleasure to read. So I would highly, highly recommend The Pretender. I thought it was fantastic. I read one romance novel this month, Say You'll Remember Me by Abby Jimenez. I've meaning to read one of her books for ages. It's about this couple, Samantha and Xavier, and they meet and have sort of like the perfect date. But the next day, Samantha is due to leave Minnesota, where they have both been living, and move back home to California on the other side of the US, because her mother has early onset dementia and she's going home to help care for her. And it's about this couple and, you know, how can they make it work with 2,000 miles between them, and also about both of their lives beyond that relationship. And a lot of it looks at Samantha's relationship with her mother and how her family are dealing with her mother's early onset dementia. Overall, I really enjoyed Say You'll Remember Me, and I thought there were some really strong elements of it. I especially thought everything with Samantha's family and her mum's dementia was dealt with very well and was really interesting. I generally feel like I preferred the life stuff to the actual romance in the novel. I think partly because the premise is basically everything is perfect except for the distance, but therefore everything is perfect except for the distance, which kind of makes it less interesting. And also it's sort of very perfect very quickly, so you're not really like watching two people fall in love, which I think is what I enjoy in a romance, because they're basically like, it's a bit insta-lovey, I suppose. They're basically in love right away, more or less, and it's them working out, well, how can we be together? Rather than working out, do we want to be together? So I feel like that's not necessarily my favourite kind of romance to read. And I think maybe what I'm actually looking for in a romance novel is not actually a romance so much as a rom-com. And maybe the balance between like romance and comedy was a bit too on the romance and not enough on the comedy for me in Say You'll Remember Me, where I feel like Emily Henry has more of the comedy. Or maybe I just, you know, that's just more my sense of humour, I don't know. I'd be interested to know if anyone has any other recommendations for Abby Jimenez novels where I should go next. If her other novels follow very different patterns, then I do think I would try another one by her. Something else I listened to on audiobook in May was a middle grade mystery novel, Montgomery Bonbon, Murder at the Museum by Alistair Beckett King. Alistair Beckett King is a comedian here in the UK whose work I really, really, really enjoy. I'll leave his YouTube channel linked down below. He does very entertaining sketches that are very silly and whimsical in all the best ways. And he also writes middle grade books for children. And the first book in the Montgomery Bonbon series, Murder at the Museum, was very, very delightful indeed. So the premise of the series is that there is this 10-year-old girl called Bonnie who basically dresses up as Poirot to solve murder mysteries. And when she puts on her big coat and her fake moustache and her beret, all of the adults around her believe that she is an old foreign detective, not a 10-year-old English girl, which, you know, obviously is very silly, but also very entertaining. At the beginning of the novel, Bonnie is at the local museum with her grandfather when one of the museum staff is killed, and her grandfather investigate. Her grandfather is her sidekick and is the only person who knows that Montgomery Bonbon, the great detective, and Bonnie Montgomery are the same person. And it's just really, really delightful. Very, very, very funny. Very, very fun, very charming in every way. So I would highly recommend Murder at the Museum, and I'm excited to continue with the series because this was great fun. Then I read 5 things that weren't novels this month, which is unusual for me. So I read one little short story collection, 5 different stories about one thing by Elizabeth Baines. This is a really interesting collection of short stories. So there are 5 stories and they're all about the same family, but following a different character within that family, and basically in a different genre. So each of the stories kind of has a different genre and a different tone to it, which I thought was a really fun way of doing an interconnected collection of short stories. And there are also, as well as being sort of character links and family links between the stories, there are also sort of thematic links between them. I really like Elizabeth Baines' writing. I've read a few things from her before, and this was really great, something I would highly recommend. I then also read 2 poetry collections. This is A Night at the Snooker by David Floyd, which is a collection of comic poetry, very, very dry, witty sense of humour that I really, really enjoyed. Some of these poems are quite odd, but like in a really entertaining way. I thought this was great, worked very, very well. And then I also read a collection of poetry by Mary Oliver. I really love Mary Oliver's poetry. I've read quite a lot of it before, but I hadn't read this collection. This is House of Lights. And I just thoroughly enjoyed these poems. I think Mary Oliver is a wonderful poet who writes just beautiful, insightful things, and particularly very interesting things about nature and the relationship between nature and humans. I am in general not like a massive one for nature poetry, but the way Mary Oliver writes nature poetry, I just love. So I thought this was fantastic and I'd highly recommend it. Then I read 2 memoirs in May. One was this is Avoidance, Drugs, Heartbreak and Dogs by Jordan Stevens. This was actually my pick for People April, and I started it at the end of April, but I didn't manage to finish it in April, so I carried it on into May and read it in May. But this is a memoir by Jordan Stevens, who is a British performer and musician. He was part of Rizzlekicks, and I ended up reading this book, although I don't read memoirs very often, because I went to an event run by the publisher Canongate nearly 2 years ago, in which Jordan Stevens was speaking about this book, and I thought it sounded really interesting, so I'm glad that I finally read it after like 2 years. This is a memoir basically about Jordan Stevens going through a period of crisis after a breakup, and sort of coming to reassess various things about himself. It's a book about masculinity and mental health, and self-image and self-confidence. It's a really interesting memoir. It's not necessarily a book I'm going to return to. As I said, I don't read that many memoirs. They're not like 100% my thing. And I also don't know how I feel about the writing style. It is very, very staccato. Lots of like 1 and 2 word sentences, which is not necessarily my favourite kind of style to read, but I am glad that I finally read it, and I did find it an interesting read. The other memoir I read in May was this. This is The Bookshop Woman by Nanako Hanada, translated from the Japanese by Kat Anderson. As I said, I don't tend to read very many memoirs. When I picked this up, I did not realise it was a memoir. It was definitely in the fiction section while I came across it. I feel like it's one of those books that has been marketed as a memoir in the US and kind of marketed as a novel in the UK, though it is published by a non-fiction publisher, and they do say it's like a true story, but it definitely, like, cover-wise, looks very like a novel. Anyway, this is a memoir from a Japanese bookseller about a time in her life when she had just come out of a marriage. Her marriage was breaking down. She was living alone and trying to meet new people. So she joined a kind of sort of dating site, but not really a dating site, a site to meet people, but not necessarily with a view to dating, sometimes potentially with a view to dating, sometimes with a view to making friends. And on that site, her sort of gimmick, as it were, was that she would recommend anyone their perfect book. So she met all of these different strangers and recommended books to them. And this memoir is about her time doing that and sort of the confidence it gave her. I did find this really interesting and enjoyable to read, but I think I probably didn't like love it quite as much as I was hoping to. And I think probably if you're looking for like a memoir about the love of books, I would probably more recommend Dear Reader by Kathy Rensenbrink. I think that this book, while it does have quite a lot in it about the love of books, I feel like it's slightly more a book about how interesting it is to meet lots of different random people than it is a book about books. And there is a lot in it about the love of books and about the sort of like significance of individual personalised book recommendations, which I did really enjoy. But there's also quite a lot about like meeting strangers and gaining confidence in meeting strangers, which I was slightly less interested in, I suppose. So I thought this was really interesting. I would still recommend it, but I think there are sort of bookish memoirs I would recommend more. So those were the things I read in May. It was a good reading month. I think my highlight of the month was definitely The Pretender by Jo Harkin, which I just thought was absolutely fantastic. But I read some other great things as well. So do let me know, did you read anything great in May? Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.